Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Ed Leaders Network live event, The Inclusion Solution, with Davon Larosa and Dr. Martina Williams. My name is Arlen Peebles with the Illinois Principals Association, and I will be your host and tech support for this afternoon's webinar. What I would like you to do right now is look over on the GoToWebinar control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. I want you to get comfortable with a couple of panels there. The first one I want you to be aware of is the audio panel. Pop that open and see the different audio types that you can be connected with. Most of you are connected with computer audio. That's great. That's the best way to listen in. But if our audio does drop out or stop at any time, you can switch over to phone call, and there'll be a teleconference line for you to dial there. I also want you to open the questions panel. This is how you're going to communicate with Dr. Williams and Davon. If they ask you to do any chats, that's where you're going to type into is the questions box. They've got a chat activity right up at the top, so I do want you to be very comfortable with that. If you have any technical issues or questions for me at any time, please type them into the questions box. I'll be monitoring that as well. And finally, there is a handouts panel. You don't need to worry about that one just yet. They have provided some session resources for you to download at the end of the presentation today. All right, that's all from me. I'm going to turn things over to Davon Larosa and Dr. Martina Williams. Hello, guys. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Arlen. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Arlen.
All right. We're going to go ahead and get started today with just some introductions and with our inclusion activity. And so, first slide, I want everybody to take a moment to introduce themselves in the chat box. Use the following demographics: your name, state, district, position, or excuse me, school, position, years of service. This will help us understand who's in the room.
Yes, and then after that, if you can answer the question and explain why briefly. Would you rather receive $10 million in a lump sum amount or never have to pay any more bills? So briefly answer that question and explain why, and we will start our webinar shortly after that. So take about 2 minutes to fill in the demographic information and then answer the would you rather question.
And weigh all factors when you do this. We understand $10 million is enticing, but just think about no more bills. So again, I don't want to sway you, but I just got to throw it out there. Yep, Mark, I see you. No more bills. I'm with you.
So Davon, I'm going to put you on the spot. Which one would you rather have?
Yes, I mean, I appreciate money and I understand. I'm seeing people in the chat here talk about investing, but that all takes like discipline and knowing where to put it. And then you could lose $10 million as quick as you could get it. So I have to be true to myself and just say to not have a car note, to not pay a house payment, those are enticing. So I got to say no more bills. How about you, Doc?
Likewise. I think if people knew I had $10 million, it would quickly be gone from the amount of requests for support from those that I love. So yeah, I would take the no more bills to get rid of some of the student loan debt and other bills that are reoccurring. I would love that option. So yeah, that would be my choice if given the option to choose.
Perfect. Appreciate that.
All right. So we can get ready to get started.
Okay.
So welcome everyone to the Inclusion Solution. I am Dr. Martina L. Williams. My friend, my colleague, Davon Larosa is joining us today. And I'm so happy that you all carved some time in your schedule to be here. So our objectives today are centered around 4 main themes: identifying exclusionary practices, unpacking inclusion gaps, exploring relationship strategies, and then discussing elements of the inclusion implementation planning loop, which is something that I have originated, and I will go into more details of that later on in the presentation. All right, so why us, why you? So basically, I'm going to share, my position with the conversation around inclusion and what I have experienced throughout my professional journey and why I'm committed to this work. So I'm from Chicago, South Side of Chicago, born and raised. Spent, most of my life there. I'm currently living in the northwest suburbs, but I didn't attend K-12 schooling while I was a student. My mom was a single mom. My father passed unexpectedly when I was 7. And so we experienced a lot of mobility, my brother and I, when we were children. And so that was, just a dynamic that I won't forget. But my mom was adamant about us being literate, so she chose to send us to private and parochial schools. We stayed with other people. We slept in our cars at times. We, again, had a lot of mobility, but tuition was always paid. She was a product of CPS, and she knew the struggles that she encountered while navigating that system. And although, she is a college graduate, she was an athlete also, so she had a lot of support matriculating through that system. And so she did not want us to sort of have those same struggles with us being literate. And so I was grateful for that sacrifice, but I don't believe that parents should have to make that sacrifice in order to assure that their children leave the K-12 setting literate. So my first encounter with public schools was as an educator, and I've been an educator for about 15 years. I started in the nonprofit sector, came into the profession as a paraprofessional, so I've sort of navigated all of the roles and responsibilities up through administration. And so my most recent position prior to me starting my consulting business this year was as an administrator out in the northwest suburbs. And so I was passionate throughout my whole career with ensuring the literacy of students in neighborhood settings. And so that has been just my sort of mantra wherever I go. And so I've seen a lot of inequities in schools, rural, suburban, inner city, with the access that students have. And personally, I have said in many conversations, especially those as of recent, that I believe when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, a lot of people put the E before the I, and I personally think that inclusivity promotes equity. So when school environments are inclusive, then equity happens by default. And so personally, I have made it my goal and probably just going to span over my career span of making sure that inclusion is amplified within the K-12 setting. And so as I come to this presentation, that's what I'm sort of bringing, that lens of seeing children have inequitable resources based on exclusionary practices. I have been a survivor of racism and discrimination in the workforce, being a woman of color. And so I know those feelings intimately. And so those are some of just the personal connections that I have to the work. And that's why I am happy to share just some of my knowledge and experiences with you all today. And hopefully something that we state can be a part of a solution that you take back to your schools and districts.
Thank you, Dr. Williams. And just a couple of things I want to add. It's no accident that you are here, that Dr. Williams and I are here together. Our stories are similar, right? And I can honestly say, without even like piggybacking too much, like our stories really intertwine. And so I truly appreciate that. I'm one of 6 kids. My mom, single mom growing up. I'm the youngest, or second to youngest of the 6. All my brothers and sisters, great people, love them to death. Have to keep it real with you. Some I love more than others. And just, we did that inclusion about the millions. And somebody said, hey, when you get millions, people are going to start, your family will start asking you for money. And I was like, want to hear a story? You don't even have to have millions for your family to have to ask for money, but I love them all to death. I'm going to say I'm the only one to graduate high school, college, so on and so forth. Started out as a teacher, assistant principal, and then principal, and then started my doctoral work and moved around just a little bit in districts just because I'd been in one place where I grew up my whole life, Northern Illinois in Rockford. Love it, have an affinity. Mom lives there, brothers and sisters live there. But I'm gonna say, like, as I got to venture around a little bit and find where my calling and where I truly wanted to be, disrupting and dismantling became like my work, right? And so 10 years ago, before people are saying equity work, we were doing equity work, right? And we just didn't know we were doing it because it was what was right and what brought people together and gave everyone a path, right? Outcomes didn't change, but the path of getting there changed, and based on what students needed. And so I think that's really important in my story. And so, yeah, I'm super excited to be here. I'm a principal in Madison, Wisconsin on the east side at La Follette High School. Yeah, and I got to meet Dr. Williams. And then again, it's no accident when people connect. And so happy to be here today to share a little bit later on in the presentation with you. Thank you.
Thanks, Davon, and grateful to have met you too. And so we have this sort of silhouette of a you, of an individual. And so as we navigate this topic, this presentation, we want you to think about what you bring to the conversation. What connections do you have to the inclusion equity work, or what you would like to grow and develop in. And so just keep that in mind as we proceed throughout the conversation today. So this is a quote by Dr. Muhammad Khalifa. He stated that leaders who are not critically self-aware or knowledgeable about racism and other histories of oppression, and who do not embrace anti-oppression and social justice, will reproduce racism and other forms of systemic oppression in their schools. And so this is a quote that we thought would be good to sort of set the premise for diving into unpacking that exclusionary gaps that without us knowing the legacy of exclusion, we can't forwardly go into creating more inclusive environments. So this is a quote that I think sort of sums up that awareness that we have to know and be self-aware of sort of what has happened in the past in order to move forward. So the legacy of exclusion. So we'll have a few slides that talks about this phenomenon that I think is very critical for us starting to talk about nationally, inclusivity. And like I said earlier, that I firmly believe that inclusion promotes equity. So I put the I before the E. But there is a legacy of exclusion. So the American social, economic, and educational system, it was designed intentionally to have a ruling elite class and a subservient class. So America was founded on principles that there was essentially not equality, that there will be a ruling class and a subservient class, and they were destined to serve them. And so to educate everyone equally would have been counterproductive of that social economic structure in which power, wealth, and status were granted on the basis of your ability to assimilate within a dominant class. So obviously these are the beginning stages of sort of why slavery existed in America, and it was to create those two classes essentially for social economic purposes. And so during slavery, teaching a person of color to read or write resulted in severe fines or imprisonment. If the perpetrator was white, whippings or worse punishment were rendered if the perpetrator was Black. So people literally lost their lives for trying to pursue literacy. They were lynched, they were killed, they were beat if Blacks were if it was known that they could read or write. And so that was a really element of fear that was established early on American soil for Blacks, that to be literate, to be knowledgeable would result in possibly losing your life. Frederick Douglass has a quote that I have attached to my signature on my email, and it says, "Knowledge makes a man unfit to be a slave." And so that is powerful. When people are aware of things, they can no longer stick to slavery or oppressive behaviors that will enchain them. So after emancipation, many whites still opposed the education of ex-slaves. So once slavery was abolished, it was not like, hey, this kumbaya moment, let's educate all the Blacks. That was not the movement. Schools that were educating Blacks were often burned. Their teachers were threatened, and any person of color who demonstrated agency, resolve, dignity, or intellect was often murdered or lynched. So this is post 1865. These intimidating practices imparted fear, distrust, and a legacy of generational trauma among African Americans that is still evident in modern day behaviors. During the 80s and 90s, you would see in movies or television shows where, some of the guys would put their books into pizza boxes so it wouldn't appear that they were, studying or going to school. And so some of the historical roots of those intimidating practices began post-slavery. And so white scientists during slavery and post-slavery conducted studies theorizing that Blacks were biologically and cognitively inferior to whites. They wanted to make it seem that Blacks had lower IQs, that their brains were smaller, that their biological makeup was different. And so this rationalization of Black intellect provided a framework for denial and essentially access. So I have this picture of Dylan Roof. I don't know how many recognize this young man's photo, but he is a young man who was 18 years old back in 2015 that shot up the church in South Charleston, Carolina, I believe, Carolina. And his reasoning for doing that, and he posted it on the internet, he believed that Blacks had lower IQs and lower impulse control and higher testosterone levels. And so he used those statements to justify him murdering 9 Black people. And so that legacy, just like Blacks sort of hold the pain of slavery in our DNA, there's a legacy of sort of these theorized ideas about that Black inferiority that has been passed on generational. This young man was 18 years old, so someone had to teach him those principles, that doctrine. And so, in our modern day society, people still have these beliefs about that Black inferiority. Historically, institutions for Black people, they differed extremely vastly from white counterparts. So these two pictures on the left, the top picture is a one-room schoolhouse for Black kids, and then the bottom is a one-room schoolhouse for white students. Same era, but as you can see, that the amount of students that are packed inside the Black school is, essentially double the amount of students that were packed in the white schools. Same era, same generation, and the students in the upper picture, obviously there's a lot of sitting pretty much on top of each other. There's not a lot of room to really spread out. They don't have their own desk. And so that is sort of giving us that visual of that historical connection about how just the schools in general, they were not equal. Even though we had that separate but equal ideology, that was not factual. And so the goal for Black education post-slavery was to create an obedient and stable semi-skilled workforce. Black people were taught predominantly how to cook, clean, perform physically challenging work, and do mental menial tasks. And this statement is still true today. And sometimes people are not aware of that, historical connection that they're having with the work that they're doing or the interactions that they're having with Black students. But in my experience, just as recently as last year, I had an interaction with a fifth grade teacher, and she was complaining to me about one of her students, a Black male in her classroom, and she was saying he's not listening, he has an attitude, and all of these other things. And so I said, well, I'll talk to student X. I didn't know student X. I've heard about him, but I never had interactions with him. And so, when I asked him, what's going on? And he said, my teacher, all she wants me to do is sweep. We have classroom helper jobs, and she always tells me to sweep. And he was literally upset about that. But I said, did you ever tell her that? He was like, no, she don't listen to me. And so I thought about that connection, about how those were the tasks that whites thought that all Blacks could do. And so now, as recent as 2019, when I had this conversation with a student, that is still sort of being carried out in some of our classrooms. And it is still affecting that psychological capacity that makes students feel included in their classroom. And students were expected to adhere to a strict course of discipline. Highly structured environments and routines were and are typical experiences for many Black students in integrated schools. So that is the norm often. If you go to a predominantly Black school, you'll see students typically in uniforms have to walk hands behind their desks, behind their backs, can't talk in the hallways. And that is a major contrast with schools that are predominantly white. So this is just a visual of the raw numbers of how Blacks were educated, the amount of Blacks that were educated compared to whites. And so this is from a study that was done in 1992. And so basically the author, he graphed the amount of students that were in school, Black and white, compared, the comparison. And as we all can see that the lines didn't start to meet until approximately 1991. So 59% of white students were being educated, compared to 5%, 10%. We get to the 20% mark sort of around the 1880s, but there's a major gap with just the access to education that Blacks have historically encountered. Davon, would you like to?
Yeah, I like this quote. It's like one of my favorite ones. When people become uncomfortable in an environment, it is normal for them to try to reestablish an environment in which they do feel comfortable. I mean, if this doesn't speak to like just us as humans, right? And I think, be it good or be it bad, and we've seen this for good or for bad, like, I mean, where's the negative here, right? And where's the positive here? And then where do we see this show up in our work? We all want connection and we want to feel connected. So how do we, right? However, sometimes that breeds something that becomes negative, right? And I think we just have to call that out. And Dr. Vernita Mayfield does so very eloquently here. Pass it back to you.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. Next slide. So this is sort of just more of that visual element of looking at the legacy of exclusion then. So these photos are from the 1960s, late 1950s. On the left, you have white men and women holding up signs saying race mixing is communism, stop the race mixing. Then on the left, you have Black leaders marching and saying, end segregated rules in public schools. Before we'll be a slave, we'll be buried in our grave. So that was sort of the vivid picture of things that were happening prior to integration. And so this is modern day, the legacy of exclusion now, that visual element. On the left, we have women have writing on their shirts that said "Make America White Again," and they're in support of Donald Trump. And so if you can look closely at the photos, there's about 3 generations represented here. And so, when we think about the legacy of exclusion, how it bothers me to see that, people are generationally teaching their children to make America white again. And so, it is offensive in many ways, because to say make America white again, that means exclusionary practices of others. And so that is, that is a more current picture. And then this picture on the right is a picture from this summer when George Floyd was murdered, Ahmaud Arbery was murdered. All of the protests that went on this summer that sort of has brought this national awareness to exclusionary practices and to the issues that we just can't ignore anymore. And so this is sort of this visual pictures of how exclusionary practices are looking now and what people are representing. So these are some discussion reflection questions. Feel free to answer them in the chat. We won't have a lot of time to sort of sift through them and see what people are writing per se because of time, but also write them down and think about them post this webinar. So, what exclusionary or how have exclusionary practices impacted 21st century classrooms, and then what exclusionary practice still exists within the K-12 setting. So feel free to write things down in the chat box, but also in your own time, reflect on these questions. So this is a quote taken from Cobb and Crownapple's book, and they stated that diversity already exists. It is not a vision we need to aspire to. Instead, we need to stop wasting our efforts on a false goal and focus tightly on an actual goal, inclusion. And so basically this quote spoke to me because it sort of states the obvious. We are diverse, gender wise, cultural wise, race wise. So diversity sort of can happen without a lot of intentionality and planning. Of course, we need more racial diversity often in environments, but inclusion is something that we need to put attention to, we need to aspire to, we need to invest in, and that comes with intentionality. So that's how that quote spoke to me. Davon, did this quote speak to you any way that you would like to share out? I know we talked about it prior.
Yeah, I mean, I'm the tech, not Arlen, the tech person. I'm over here running the slides and watching the chat. And so I do want to just lean into this quote for a couple of reasons. I'm seeing as words pop up, and I know you all can't see each other's. I respect everybody for being here. And I think that it's really important that we understand diversity exists, but it's our job as these leaders is how do we celebrate it? What are we doing? And how are we creating this inclusive space? So these questions are to pull at your heartstrings, and these quotes are to help you be reflective. And so I truly appreciate this. And so it's tough for me because I'm watching the slides and the chat. So yeah, Doc, I'll flip it back to you. Thank you.
Awesome. And I can't see either one. So it's kind of just navigating through it. But I do appreciate those who are interacting in the chat box and are thinking about some of the things that we are talking about. So thank you. So, how did this happen? I sort of gave that precursor about the legacy of exclusion, but over the next few minutes, we'll sort of unpack it more. And so I thought this bridge, I'm not sure what bridge this is that collapsed, but often, and especially in the year 2020, which represents, often hindsight, we sort of look back to see, well, how did this happen? George Floyd obviously was not the first Black man that was murdered in broad daylight by the hand of police, and so many others. The list goes on of, of people that have sort of been done wrong, right? Again, we have 200 plus years of slavery. So that sort of speaks for itself too. But in specific to inclusion gaps within schools and within just the context of being exclusionary, those inclusion gaps are often rooted in oppressive practices. So as we know, slavery was a period of oppression. And so that speaks for itself that was an inclusion, that created this gap in inclusion because slaves were excluded from, the Constitution. I tell people often, I said, you all have to realize that up until the 14th Amendment, Blacks were not even written in the Constitution as a whole human being. We were written as 3/5 human. So that is a lot to sort of navigate and to prove that a lot of us are just proving that we're human. And so that is a big practice that created a major gap. And so normalizing the practice of sending Black students to in-school suspension rooms, that is an oppressive practice that has this historical context post-slavery. Having SROs, they are predominantly seen in minoritized populations where there is a large number of students of color. You'll have more school resource officers in those schools. And then inclusion gaps are perpetuated by the achievement gap. School reform policies create inequitable accountability metrics and inferior academic experiences. School reform policies did not even occur until integration. And ability grouping and or tracking systems disproportionately marginalize students of color. As we know, there are a lot of students of color that are labeled, as special under, IEP plans. They have IEP plans where we group students, red, yellow, green, or, meeting, exceeding, not meeting. Those are ability groups that often marginalize students of color. And then minoritized students are more susceptible to overrepresentation within remedial, disciplinary, and disability programs, as I just stated. So the amount of students that are suspended annually are definitely representative of students of color far more than white students.
Doc, can I just chime in here? One
Absolutely.
that's on my mind. So there was a movement just after George Floyd was publicly lynched. I'm gonna use the words my superintendent used. I'm gonna say that, so Madison, very liberal city, Wisconsin, it didn't take much. We removed SROs from the school. And so now there is a board subcommittee talking about what replaces it, right? And what is the lever, what is the move? Should police have ever been in schools? I always talk about it's a very 1990 approach. I know because I graduated in 2002, but I'm gonna say like things that we're exploring in this committee that's very public and you can Google it, is restorative practices, proactive restorative, so that we're not repairing harm, but we're building community. Multifaceted approach of life coaching, mental health services. For students, I had a young lady say, I've been trying to get a therapist since in 7th grade, but no one will hear me, right? I want to just remove that barrier. How come mental health services aren't available for everybody or for whomever needs them or is asking for them right in school? Life coaching, here's where I am, but where I want to be. Again, that's a very specific job of a life coach. I'm not saying a counselor can't do that, but I'm saying this is very specific work that they deal in. And so the other part is strategic partnerships. I want to be a rapper, so get me some time in a rap studio, right? And so what partners are out that are willing to support my school? What chef would be willing to come in? What person will let me shadow an elementary classroom? And so these are, like, in my mind, what make up to replace the SRO. I work with a woman who said that basically your most vulnerable population is going to engage you. How will you proactively engage them? And I think it's a multifaceted approach. Police was the wrong option. And so I just want to throw that out there.
Absolutely. And I'm not saying that, some schools have greater disciplinary concerns, but often, there are major oppressive gaps in the community. And so we have to sort of have that both and conversation. Well, we can't just flood schools with police officers and then there are no community programs in marginalized communities. There are no grocery stores. Like literally, that is real. The food deserts are real, and so we have to have that balance of eradicating oppressive practices. But as school leaders, we are often just focused on, the school culture and climate and environment. And so these are more of the direct and indirect exclusionary practices that are often seen in school. And a lot of these that will be sort of referenced, they are uncomfortable to acknowledge, to accept that perhaps I have been perpetuating, these exclusionary practices. And so our reason for highlighting them is not to make anyone feel ashamed or bad, but to bring awareness. Because again, as Frederick Douglass said, knowledge makes a man unfit to be a slave. And so once we know, what we're doing wrong, we can figure out how to get it right. And so these examples were taken out of actually Bob Cobb's and Crown Apple's book that we'll share that at the end. But some of the common direct exclusionary practices in school suspension, out of school suspension, in school detention, zero tolerance policies. I have seen that a lot in schools with high numbers of African American students in particular. The zero tolerance policy, which crushes children's spirit essentially. That they have no room to be children. Yes, there are some things that obviously, we can't tolerate, but to have so many zero tolerance policies within a school, it really does crush, as Dr. Love says, crush that Black joy. Law enforcement policies, allowing students to miss school or class without any repercussions. Those students who are behavior challenges, how often do we really follow up with them when they are absent? How often do we extend that check-in when they are absent, even though they may be challenging, but that is considered an exclusionary practice. And allowing students to disengage from learning, student deal making. I have literally witnessed teachers that have difficult students in their class sort of make this deal with them. Hey, I'll let you get on the computer for the whole class period if you don't disrupt the class. So we have let this student, go by multiple days not engaged, but they're silent, and we're not, hearing from administrators coming to our room to support us. But, essentially we have excluded the student from learning because we don't want them to bother our classroom. So we let them go on the computer for a whole period, multiple times a week. And then some of the more indirect, or some people may classify this under this implicit bias sort of dialogue too, grade retentions. That is systemic. Again, these school reform efforts did not come into play until integration happened. So then all of a sudden, when Blacks are sort of, liberated to be in schools with whites, then all of a sudden we have these retention conversations, and predominantly students of colors are retained because the curriculum often, can you go back, Davon, does not support an inclusive environment for students of colors. Constant ODRs. I've been in school districts where on average the schools, have for elementary building almost 2,000 ODRs a year for preschool to 5th grade students. Unwelcoming to parents and community members. I have seen, teachers and administrators mistreat parents. Either they don't speak Spanish or they don't look clean, and so we're not as welcoming to parents that are more affluent, and not valuing non-white behavior, cultural capital, language, or dress. So not valuing sort of things that are culturally connected to students of color. As Davon mentioned earlier about, if a student wants to be a rapper or a comedian, I remember a story that I believe it was Jamie Foxx that shared how when he was in elementary school, he loved to be like the class clown. And his teacher saw that he actually had some talent, but of course it wasn't always appropriate. So she made this arrangement with him that say, hey, if you do your work, if you do the right thing on Fridays, I'll give you X amount of minutes to sort of have that comedic time with your classmates. And as we know now, he is a well-renowned comedian. But another exclusion or indirect exclusionary practice is hostile treatment, ignoring, ridiculing, harassment, or denial of oppression. There are a lot of school staff members, teachers, leaders that ignore some of these oppressive factors, and they treat the children in a hostile, manner. They come in on Monday morning, not even asking Johnny or Sally, how was your weekend, but having these expectations that they're going to mess up, and so you treat them in a hostile way. And then emotional abuse, shaming, tokenizing. Tokenizing is something that we don't talk about often, but if there is a student of color that is really thriving, or doing well, we're not expecting them to be a high achiever, then we tokenize them. That is a exclusionary practice too, because now they're having issues socially with their peers because they're viewed as the teacher's pet and things of that nature. Davon?
Yep, sorry about that. I'm reading the chat and I'm doing two things. So sorry about that. So just things, again, for time's sake, we want you to think about like what inclusion gaps can you identify in your school or school district, right? And we'd love for you to share those just in the chat. Because I mean, this is like part of the work, right? We have to identify our blind spots. When we do equity work, when we do just this mirror work, looking at ourselves, it's important that we identify these blind spots so we know what we need to do, right? And so I think it's a vulnerability. Somebody told me vulnerability is a superpower, and that's okay just to name them. And the next step is, what has been the biggest inclusion barrier for you or within your school, right? And this is, again, like tying right into that about vulnerability, and that we have to name it in order to tame it, right? And that's super important to this work.
Absolutely. And like I said, I can't see the chat, so I'm glad that you're keeping an eye on that. But I would definitely love to know, what exclusion gaps can people identify. And again, this is, the deep work, because it's easy for us to sort of identify areas that we do well in. But when we think about inclusion gaps and tying it to that sort of historical systemic connection, that takes a little bit more work and a little bit more ownership, and it makes us become vulnerable. And until I think that we really become vulnerable, we can't really move forward. As long as I'm saying I don't have a problem, I don't need any, support, then no one can really even step in to help me fix the problem. And none of us have the grand solution, but we do have solutions that we have seen worked in our experiences, and we hope that we can support you all along the journey. All right, so here we get into some of the more solution-oriented part of the webinar. Again, this is not an end-all, be-all solution, but it's definitely something that we thought were worth noting. So that's sort of what we'll get into this part of the webinar. So the concept of belonging has been missing. In fact, belonging has been neglected in the name of achievement, which is an environment where only the achieving belong. Daniel Cortez said that. And so when we think about belonging, like that is the main sort of piece to inclusion, that people have to feel this desire, or not desire, but they have to feel like you want them there. Whether it's children, whether it's the adults, we have an issue with teacher retention, we have an issue with administrator retention. And, just from my personal experience as being, the only African-American person in my role as an administrator, that was hard. And so there were a lot of times I didn't even feel like I belonged. And so these are real concepts that we really need to make sure that we are promoting in our schools, in our classrooms, in our districts. So belonging matters. So this is a picture of Dr. W.B. Du Bois. He was the first African-American person to receive a doctorate from Harvard University in 1963. I'm sorry, 1961, I believe. So before slavery ended, he had attained a doctorate. He was living in the Massachusetts area where they had already abolished slavery in the 1700s. But he dedicated his entire career proving scientifically that Blacks deserve to be treated as human. They were not inferior and that they belonged. So he is one of the founding members of NAACP, and that was his anthem because, as we noted earlier, the white scientists were trying to show that we were inferior, we did not belong, we had smaller brain capacity. So Dr. Du Bois led the work into this conversation around belonging and that we were equal. And so he highlighted that belonging is not that belonging is a psychological need. After food and water, it must be fulfilled. So when we think about Maslow hierarchy order of needs, you know, the base level is food and shelter. And then after that, we have to feel like we belong to something or to, you know, some organization. And then belonging produces confidence, community, connection, and inclusion. So without belonging, you won't be confident. Our students won't be confident in our schools if they don't feel like they belong, if they don't have a connection to the community. It's bigger than, you know, in February, you know, throwing up a picture of Martin Luther King or, you know, all of that. It's bigger than that. And so belonging is really critical. And without belonging, we won't reach the achievement that we need to reach for our schools. And we must create and maintain environments where all students feel that they belong to ensure educational equity. We have to prioritize belonging. Just like we prioritize, you know, test scores and all of that, belonging has to be a priority in order to promote those sort of equitable outcomes. And then obviously after achievement comes after belonging. So like I just stated, we will never reach, you know, those achievement or closing that achievement gap without effectively closing the inclusion gap.
All right, and like Dr. Williams, thank you. I mean, there's a perfect setup, right, to like dive into like some of the like solution pieces, right? And so if you came today and you're like, what can I take away today? But it's completely important to understand like how we got here. And so I understand all of that, right? And so what am I prepared to do, right? And so this is hopefully going to feed that part of your soul, so to speak. And so when we talk about like belonging matters, it's really important that we understand that this is for kids, stakeholders, for staff. Like voice, I cannot stress enough that voice is completely important to our work, and that if we're not embedding voice into our staff meeting, if we're not embedding voice into our classrooms from stakeholders or from students, like I don't know that we're really doing the work. One particular practice or strategy is like shining a light on everyone. We do this thing called Voices from the Field. We literally ask the teacher to say, we just did virtual parent-teacher conferences where we focused on the kids who had the D's and F's. We asked the teacher to come to a staff meeting virtually and say, give us 5 minutes on your perspective about how this worked. And then we shined a light on her, so to speak, about her exemplary practice of how she ran her conferences, which I think is really important to do when we start talking about belonging. You have to be doing identity work. Like I mentioned earlier, like if you can Google identity wheel, I think it comes out of the University of Arizona or something to that effect, where there's this identity wheel. You have to understand your blind spots. You have to know who you are. So much of equity work is mirror work. It's not looking out a window at what Martina needs to change about herself or what, but really it's about what Davon needs to do. So understanding that you have to have a place and a space to do this identity work is super important when we start talking about strategies. Something that I think is super important is leaving an empty space. If you do restorative in your school, leave an empty chair when you do a circle, because what that allows for, it allows for whoever's coming in next to have a space. And you don't even know who that person is, but you're gonna hold a space. So before I got my job in Madison, I got to go to a couple principal affinity groups, and they're leaders of color that meet on work time, sanctioned by work, where the Black leaders come together and leaders of color come together, and they held a chair for the next person. I was like, why is there an empty chair sitting in our circle? And she's like, that's how you got here. And I didn't understand when she responded to me. It let me know that all the while, if you hold a space, you never know who's gonna come, but you're holding and you're holding out and waiting for the next person to come join you. And it's not exclusionary, but rather inclusive. We want the next person who's gonna be amazing and be awesome right here in this work with us to know that they're welcome. I'll leave a chair in meetings now, people, and I explain that story. How do you make everyone feel chosen, right? Like, how do you, again, it's like shining a light. How do I feel like I'm the one that, like, if I'm the student in the class or if I'm the teacher, that you see me, that you hear me, and that I matter? Right now in the pandemic, I don't know if you're virtual or hybrid or whatever the case, or you're just back in person. It's so important that we're doing social emotional learning now more than ever. It was a thing in the 90s and went away, and we went on looking at normative exams and how important they were. But it's important that we get back to our cell work, not just for our students, but for our staff as well, and for each other, right? Even as colleagues. I got to go to Harvard a couple times, and that really struck a relationship with some professors there. And one time we're having a conversation, we're in Cambridge, we're at a restaurant, we're just talking about this idea of symmetry. And it totally spoke to me. And it wasn't until like I broke down, I was never really good at math, just gonna go ahead and throw it out there. If there are math people in the room, I appreciate you, respect you, and love you. But when I took an adult look at the word symmetry, we started talking about relationships, belonging, and inclusion. It starts here. Are you willing to park your title? Are you willing to park your credentials to get on the same level as other people, right? So if you have teachers, aides, bus drivers, our students, parents that may not have all the degrees that we have, are we willing to park all of that and say, I'm like you? And like you, here's what I believe, right? I very oftentimes I'm writing a message to my community. I'll say, as a dad, as a single dad of a 7-year-old, here is my belief, right? And then someone's connecting with me. Someone's saying, you know what? I hear what the guy's saying. I'm with you. And so oftentimes, I think it's very important that we use this idea of symmetry to know that we are like the other part, that we're not that different, and we're reciprocal, and that we're willing to park our titles and our position and our salary to say, I'm like you. Because we hear that all the time, right? We'll say, oh, you'll tell a student a story. When I was in high school, there's more symmetry than you think, right? And so I think it's really important as an inclusive strategy that you lead with this. I think it's, and again, people help wake me up with this philosophy, so I'm just sharing it with you as well. There's something, I believe it's out of University of Stanford, or Stanford University. It's these liberatory equity mindsets, these pictures here off to the side. I'll use another one here in just a second. I took these from an activity we did with my staff, right? And so it's really important that we bring our full selves to our staff. We bring our full self to our students. But when we do that, we're bringing just 3 key values, right? And so when you're running a meeting, when you're talking to students, when you're talking with a parent who's upset, that we're bringing trust, generosity, love, and like, how can you go wrong with these pieces of the puzzle, right? And so it's really important, and I know it's like, so where's the tangible? Absolutely. Like, and I'll show you that in just a second. It's important that when we listen, we're listening from a place of love and not judgment or shame or blame, because we don't know that person's story and their experience. It's really important. It's also important when we start talking about symmetry that we're humble, right? That we have to take a step back and be humble and acknowledge that we're not an expert. And what if you actually are an expert? Experts can learn too. We have to honor people's stories and experiences. And we have to recognize their emotion and empathize. I think that's super important. When we start talking about inclusion, like, we have to know what's going on in our community, be a part of it. And sometimes we live outside of our communities that we work, and that's okay, but we just need to stay that much more connected to the place that we work. And where you can, and I'm gonna say everywhere you can, engage in collective decision making. You are the expert. You get that paycheck, it's yours. However, how can you share? How can you bring others in? Because that's what leadership is, and you know that. The other piece that I just want to throw out there is something that we named as our core value. This year with 168 staff, we're in last year 168 staff in a room, because you can't have 168 people in a room. That's why we're here right now. But 168 people in a room. We said if we were going to build a high school that truly focused on one value that spoke to who we are and truly exuded everything that we believe and talk about who we are, what would it be? And we had some help, but we nailed it down to one thing: building relational trust amongst each other. And this is like the ultimate thing for me when it comes to inclusion. It's developing a common language. At my school, we say copy that, right? After somebody says something in a text message, anybody will do it. You'll just you'll be talking to someone, copy that. And it's just letting people know, I got you, I'm with you. We hold one-on-one conversations to talk about grades, to talk about how you're doing, to talk about something I want you to, maybe a conference I want you to go to or a webinar. We include people on emails and we don't exclude. You know, I say when in doubt, just go ahead and CC that out, right? Should I add so-and-so to this email? What's the harm? Go ahead and add them. Be an includer, not an excluder. Create collaborative inquiry teams, a think tank. We're trying to think through this problem. I'm gonna try to get as many voices from the field, parents, as many as I can, and I often just pull together random think tanks. People say, man, he just gets people together. But because I think that's that collective decision making, right? Builds a relational trust. Build systems of support. We can talk all day about MTSS, but I think it's super important that you have automated, intentional systems of support for staff and for students. The last thing I will say is I believe in design thinking. It's all open source. You can type design thinking. There's a million things about it. You have to give people a license to innovate, right? Making it comfortable to try new things and to get your hands dirty and get in the weeds, right? Let me try this with you. And I think these are the strategies that I stand by when it comes to inclusion, when it comes to equity work, building trust. Sorry. And so I just want to leave you with this quote. Dr. Williams, you got me?
Yeah, we have 1 minute left. So inclusion is about partnering with the people we are serving and changing the culture so that they experience access and unconditional belonging. All the things that Davon sort of gave reference to, the actual things that he's done throughout his career at his school currently, that speaks to that sort of unconditional belonging. It's not perfect, but it's an effort, and that's all that we sort of need to do is put forth an intentional effort to make sure that not just our students belong, but our staff too. And so we are out of time. Davon, if you could fast forward just to the slide about the implementation plan very briefly, and then we're going to have a survey that you all can fill out. And then we're also sharing a handout that has our contact information and some resources that we didn't really get to unpack today. But the inclusion implementation planning loop, that is something that I have created, and it's a process that will promote inclusion, which will promote equitable outcomes. So this is a process that I will lead schools through, starting with the IDI assessment, which is a research-based assessment process that will give formalized assessment data to drive the inclusion work. So this is something that Davon and I can lead your school, your team through to promote that sort of equitable outcomes through exclusion. So this is something that I would love to share and process with you all as the future sort of unravels post-COVID, or even through COVID. There are things that we can still do to be more inclusive. But I believe Arlen just posted the link to the survey. And then go back one slide, because these are the last two reflection questions that we would like for you to think about throughout your career, throughout this school year in particular. But how does your school district plan for inclusion and celebrate diversity? And how are marginalized and minoritized students experiencing education within your school or district? And so really, these questions sort of put you in other people's shoes. And so we just want you all to sort of think about that as the days sort of go by. So thank you all for sharing this time with us. The handout has the resources that are on the page that we didn't get to unpack. This is our contact information, which is also a part of that resource, that handout document that is under handouts. Arlen, back to you.
All right, well, Davon, Martina, thank you so much for spending this time with us and sharing these awesome inclusion strategies. Do you two have just a couple minutes to answer some of the questions that have come in? We don't have a ton of questions, but and feel free if you need to log out. It's after 4 already. I totally understand. But we've got a couple of questions if you wouldn't mind addressing them.
Absolutely.
Okay, wonderful. First one here coming from Mary. I just received a list of student names for me to call home. These students were stated as having poor attendance and very little engagement. Grades are also poor. When I looked up the students to get contact information, I noticed that all the students were minority students. How do I address this with the teachers?
I would, a lot of my research was around chronic absenteeism. And so one thing that I have helped schools do and things I've done in my career is having a process sort of when we have metrics for reaching out to students. We should not only be calling students, after they've missed 20 days of school. Day one, there should be sort of an alert, an awareness that these kids are absent. So addressing it through a system would probably be the best solution so that it does not happen again. Creating a process for the first absence. There is some form of interaction that the school has with the student and not waiting to the 5th or 10th absent when, it's sort of really hard to reverse those patterns of absenteeism at that point.
Yeah, I'm the king of empathy interviews. If you want to know anything, like do an empathy interview with whomever, do it with your child, do it with your partner, do it with whoever. But I mean, it's okay to understand someone's lived experience. And the only way you'll get to do that is truly to listen with love and ask questions. And so we have students that aren't engaging in my district, right? I pop up with some tacos and some Pepsis and be like, hey, with my mask on, 6 feet away, what's up? Right? And it's okay to have conversation, but if you're not willing to take a risk, and I would tell this to teachers, if you're not willing to take a risk, like I'm gonna need you to, right? And what is the risk you're willing to take? But I will give people, unsafe, I hear, you don't wanna be unsafe, but discomfort is great, all right?
Mm-hmm.
Very good, thank you for that. Final question here coming from Matt. Where do we start with our staff? Kind of an open-ended question there.
Yeah, that's a great question. Not knowing where you are, there's a way we can connect to like outside too, that we shared info, but I would say have a conversation with us if you're interested, and we can literally pinpoint some places to start. But not knowing where you are and what work you've done, I think there are many entry points, and again, I'd be happy to coach you as Doc would. And so yeah, but Dr. Williams, what would you add?
Yeah, I think the best way to start is to start. Even there's a protocol that I love that I've done in many settings. It's called the Fear and Hope Protocol. And so basically the Fear and Hope Protocol, if you have not used it, it asks for, participants, whatever setting you're sort of in, is to write down their fears around this topic. And then, what do they hope for in relation to that topic? And so that has always been a great entry point for me to use when, I'm sort of in foreign territory. And the subject of inclusion, equity, diversity, race, those are uncomfortable topics for people who have not been used to engaging in that dialogue. A friend of mine, she lives in California, and she was telling me that she's white, but she was telling me over the summer that, when the George Floyd things were happening, and the movement rather was happening, that during the Rodney King incident, she was in college and she was able to turn off the TV. She had sort of that privilege of ignoring it, essentially, and I just shared with her, I said, well, Blacks don't have that privilege of ignoring certain things. And so that sort of became a dialogue that we had. And so I would encourage you with your staff is to just have that conversation. What are your fears around talking about inclusivity, promoting equity, race relationships. What are your hopes around it too, as an outcome? And like Davon said, we definitely can talk offline too.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Dr. Williams and Davon, for sharing your expertise and all these great strategies for inclusion. I want to thank our participants for joining the live webinar. This was recorded, and I'll be sending out a link to the recording tomorrow, as well as an evaluation for Illinois participants who are looking for the 1-hour professional development credit for attending live. So you are free to now close the GoToWebinar control panel, and that will log you out of the session for today. Take care, everybody, and have a great rest of the week.
Thank you all.